The bell had not even finished ringing when Alira Voss rubbed the last of the crushed root into her wrists and knew there was no turning back. Her hands smelled like something dead, not just old, dead. She had mixed valerian root with spoiled comfrey and a strip of meat left to rot for 6 days in a clay jar behind the healer's cottage, and now the smell of it clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing she could not remove. She pressed her wrists together one more time, closed her eyes, and breathed it in. It made her stomach turn. Good. If it turned her stomach, it would turn his. Outside the cottage, the road to the castle was already crowded. Women walked in groups of 3 and 4, dressed in silk the color of sunrise, their hair braided with ribbons, their skin dusted with rose powder. Alira watched them from the window and felt something twist inside her chest that was not quite envy and not quite fear. It was closer to dread. Today, every unmated woman in the kingdom between the ages of 18 and 25 was required to walk before the throne of Chaol Ashgrove, the Alpha King, so that he could choose a bride from among them. 100 women, 1 king. And Alira Voss had spent the last 3 nights making sure she would be the one he never wanted to look at twice. She had heard the stories since she was a child. Everyone had. Chaol Ashgrove was not a king who ruled with soft words and open hands. He was a king built from war, a man whose name made grown soldiers straighten their backs before they even saw his face. It was said his senses were sharper than any alpha born in 3 generations, that he could smell fear from across a room, that he could smell a lie on a person's skin the way other men smelled rain before a storm. It was said that the last woman who caught his eye, 11 years ago, had not survived what came after. Nobody spoke the details aloud. They didn't have to. The silence around her name was enough. Alira did not want to be chosen. She did not want silk, or a crown, or a king who could smell secrets. She wanted to finish her apprenticeship with Nora, the village healer, and spend her life setting bones and boiling fevers out of children too small to complain about the taste of the medicine. She wanted a life that was hers. So when the summons came, stamped with the royal seal, ordering every eligible woman to appear before the throne at midday, she had not run. She had not hidden. She had done something far more practical. She had made herself impossible to want. The walk to the castle took the better part of an hour. Alira kept her hood up and her sleeves pulled low, though it did nothing to hide the smell. If anything, the fabric trapped it closer to her skin, and by the time she reached the outer gates, even the guards flinched as she passed. One of them pressed the back of his hand to his nose without meaning to be seen doing it. She almost smiled. Almost. The courtyard beyond the gates had been transformed into something out of a story told to children before bed. White cloth draped from every column. Flowers she did not recognize, grown somewhere warmer than this kingdom, spilled from silver urns along the walkway. Musicians played something slow and formal near the far wall, though nobody was dancing. Nobody would dare. Today was not for dancing. Today was for standing very still and hoping the king's eyes passed over you like wind over water, leaving no mark at all. Alira found her place in the line assigned to her district. The woman beside her, a baker's daughter named Grace with warm brown skin and a nervous habit of twisting her ring finger, glanced at her once and then again, more slowly the second time, her nose wrinkling before she caught herself and looked away, embarrassed. "You smell like something crawled into a jar and stayed there a week," Grace whispered, not unkindly. "That's the plan," Alira whispered back. Grace's eyes widened, and for just a moment something like understanding passed between them. The quiet solidarity of 2 women who did not want to be picked for a life neither of them had chosen. Grace didn't laugh, but her shoulders loosened, just slightly, as if she had been given permission to hope for something too. The line began to move. Alira had expected the walk toward the throne to take a long while, given there were 100 women ahead of her, each one required to pass before the king so he could look, only look, and decide with a single glance whether she was worth a second one. She had not expected to feel every step in her knees, her stomach folding over itself with something that was not quite nerves and not quite anger, though it carried pieces of both. At the front of the hall, raised on a dais of black stone veined with silver, sat the Alpha King. Chaol Ashgrove did not look like the stories. That was Alira's first thought, and it surprised her enough that she almost lost her nerve to remember why she was disguising herself at all. She had expected a monster, something built from scars and cruelty, something that looked the way his reputation sounded. Instead, she saw a man in his early 30s with dark hair pushed back from a face that held no expression at all, sitting with the kind of stillness that came from years of forcing his body into obedience even when his mind wanted otherwise. His eyes were pale, the color of frost on a window in early morning, and they moved over the line of women in front of him with the patience of a man counting sheep rather than choosing a wife. One by one, the women stepped forward. One by one, he looked, and looked away. Some he studied for a heartbeat longer than others. A woman with red hair and a proud chin held his gaze for 3 full seconds before he moved on, and Alira heard the woman exhale so hard afterward that her whole body seemed to deflate with relief, or perhaps disappointment. It was impossible to tell which the women wanted more. Grace, 3 places ahead of Alira, walked forward, curtsied the way she'd clearly practiced 100 times in front of a mirror, and was dismissed with barely a glance. She returned to the line looking as though she had been handed back her whole life. Then it was Alira's turn. She stepped forward the way she had rehearsed, chin level, shoulders back but not proud. A woman who did not want to be seen did not stand like she wanted to be seen. She kept her eyes down, the way the other rejected women had, and waited for the king's attention to slide past her, the way it had slid past 90 women before. It did not slide past. She felt it before she understood it. The air around her changed, the way a room changes when someone opens a door to a colder hallway. She looked up, against every instinct that told her not to, and found Cale Ashgrove no longer looking through her. He was looking at her, his pale eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring once, twice, like a man trying to place a sound he had heard before but could not name. The hall, which had been humming with quiet formality, went silent enough that Alira could hear her own heartbeat. Cale Ashgrove leaned forward, just slightly, his hands still resting on the arms of his throne, and inhaled again. She had expected disgust. She had built the whole plan on disgust. Rotting herbs, spoiled meat, a stench so wrong that even a king known for iron control would not be able to stop his own face from twisting. She had expected him to wave her away faster than any woman before her, glad to be rid of the smell as much as the sight. Instead, his expression did something far stranger. It sharpened, not into disgust, into focus, as though he had found something in the wrongness of the smell instead of simply the wrongness itself. The way a man might notice a door left unlocked and understand, in an instant, that someone had wanted him to notice it. "Stop," he said. His voice was low, not loud, but it carried through the hall the way a struck bell carries through still air. Alira felt every eye in the courtyard swing toward her at once. She had wanted invisibility. What she had instead was the full and complete attention of 100 women, a court of nobles, and the king himself. All because of a smell she had made with her own 2 hands to guarantee the opposite. Cale rose from his throne. Not fully, not stepping down from the dais, but enough that his shadow stretched long across the black stone floor and touched the hem of her dress. His eyes had not left her face. "What is that?" he said. Not a question shaped like a question, a demand shaped like curiosity, which somehow felt worse. Alira's mouth had gone dry. She thought of every excuse she had prepared on the walk to the castle, every clever, harmless lie about a skin condition, or an allergy to the perfumed oils the other women wore. None of them came. Instead, what came out was smaller, quieter, and far more honest than she intended. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace." It was, of course, a lie, and they both knew it. A ripple of something moved through his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, something that might have been the beginning of amusement in a man who did not seem built for amusement at all. "You do," he said, "but you're good at hiding it, almost as good as you are at making yourself smell like something the dogs wouldn't touch." A few nervous laughs rippled through the nearest nobles before dying under the weight of the king's stillness. Alira felt her face heat. Humiliation and fury tangled together so tightly she could not tell where one ended and the other began. She had wanted to disappear. Instead, she stood in front of the entire court, marked as strange, as suspicious, as exactly the kind of woman who drew attention rather than repelled it. "You may return to the line," Cale said finally, and something in his tone made it clear this was not the end of the matter, only the end of this particular moment. "You will not be dismissed today." Alira's stomach dropped. Around her, whispers began, quiet enough to be deniable, loud enough to make sure she heard every word. She stepped back into the line beside Grace, who reached over and gripped her hand once, hard, a silent question and a silent apology all at the same time. The rest of the choosing passed in a blur Alira barely registered. Women stepped forward. Women were dismissed. The dais grew a small cluster of women who had been asked to remain. Chosen for reasons Alira understood, women with striking beauty or noble blood or both, standing off to the side in a loose group that eyed each other the way hounds eye each other before a hunt begins. She was placed among them, though she did not belong there, not by any measure that made sense to her. She stood at the edge of that cluster smelling like rot and ruin, watched by women dressed for a wedding they were suddenly less certain of winning, watched most of all by the king himself, whose eyes returned to her more than once across the long remainder of the ceremony. each time lingering a moment too long to be accidental. When the last woman had been seen and the ceremony finally ended, a guard approached the small cluster of remaining women and read from a scroll the names of those who would be summoned again in the coming days for further ceremonies of courtship and consideration. Elira braced herself, certain her name would be among them, certain that whatever strange interest the king had taken in her would only deepen with time she did not want to give him. Her name was not called. Instead, a different guard approached her directly, a tall man with a scar through one eyebrow and an expression that gave away nothing. He did not speak to her the way the other names had been read, formally, for the whole court to hear. He spoke quietly, close enough that only she could catch the words. "The king has ordered a physician's examination," he said. "You are to report to the healer's wing of the castle tomorrow at first light. This is not a request." "An examination for what?" Elira asked, though some cold, sinking part of her already suspected the answer. The guard's eyes flicked, just once, to her wrists, where the last traces of crushed root still clung faintly to her skin beneath her sleeve. "For whatever it is you're hiding," he said, and walked away before she could answer. Elira stood alone at the edge of the courtyard as the crowd began to disperse around her. Women returning to their families with relief or disappointment written plainly on their faces, nobles murmuring behind painted fans about the strange girl who had smelled like a grave, and somehow still caught the king's attention. She looked down at her own wrists, at the skin she had ruined on purpose, and felt, for the first time since she had begun brewing that terrible mixture 3 nights ago, that she had made a mistake she did not yet understand the size of. She had wanted to be unwanted. Instead, she had become the one thing a king like Chaol Ashgrove could not seem to look away from. The walk home felt longer than the walk there. Grace fell into step beside her without a word, offering the kind of silent company that asked no questions and demanded no explanations. And Elira was grateful for it in a way she did not have words for yet. The sky had turned the color of a healing bruise by the time they reached the edge of the village, purple bleeding into orange, and somewhere behind them, high on the hill where the castle sat like a closed fist over the kingdom, a king who had buried a mate 11 years ago, and never spoken her name since, was sitting alone in his chambers, still turning over the memory of a smell that should have disgusted him, and instead had not let go. Elira did not know that yet. She only knew that tomorrow, at first light, she would have to walk back through those gates and answer questions she had spent 3 nights and a jar of rotted meat trying to make sure nobody would ever ask. She went to sleep that night with her wrists scrubbed raw from washing, and the smell would not come off no matter how hard she tried. The healer's wing of the castle smelled of crushed mint and boiled linen, and Elira arrived before the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall, her stomach tight with a feeling she refused to call fear. A guard met her at the small side door reserved for servants and tradespeople, not the grand entrance the silk-dressed women had used the day before. He led her through a narrow corridor lined with shelves of dried herbs and glass jars, past a row of empty cots, into a room at the back where a woman in a healer's apron stood waiting, with her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. "You're the one," the woman said. It was not a question. "I suppose I am," Elira answered, though she had no idea which particular thing she was being accused of being. The healer, who introduced herself only as Agnes, motioned for Elira to sit on a low stool near the window, where the light was strongest. She did not smile. She did not offer comfort. She simply began her examination with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been given an order she did not understand and did not wish to discuss. "Hold out your wrists." Elira did, and Agnes leaned close, sniffing once, her nose wrinkling exactly the way every other nose had wrinkled the day before. But where the court had recoiled and whispered, Agnes only frowned harder, more thoughtful than disgusted, the frown of a woman trying to solve a puzzle rather than escape a smell. "Valerian," Agnes muttered, "and something rotted, meat I'd guess left too long in a warm jar." She looked up sharply. "You did this yourself." There was no point denying it. Agnes was clearly skilled enough to have already guessed the truth. Lying now would only make Elira look foolish rather than clever. "I did," she admitted. "Why?" "Because I did not want to be chosen." For the first time since Elira had entered the room, something in Agnes's expression softened, just slightly, a flicker of understanding passing behind her tired eyes, before she caught herself and pressed her mouth back into its professional line. "Well," she said, "it worked in every way, except the one you wanted." Before Elira could ask what that meant, the door at the far end of the room opened, and every ounce of ease Agnes had allowed herself vanished at once. She straightened, smoothed her apron, and stepped back with her head bowed just enough to show respect without groveling. Chaol Ashgrove entered without announcement, without guards trailing behind him, dressed more simply than he had been on the throne, in a dark tunic that made him look less like a king and more like a man who had walked here on his own 2 feet because he wanted to, not because ceremony demanded it. His pale eyes found Alira immediately, the way they had found her in the crowded hall the day before, and she felt the same strange shift in the air, as though the room had grown smaller the moment he stepped into it. "Leave us," he said to Agnes, not unkindly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Agnes left without a word, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt, to Alira, like the sound of a trap springing shut. Cale did not sit. He stood near the window, arms loosely crossed, studying her the way he had studied her across the length of the throne room, except now there was no crowd to hide behind, no line of other women to blend into. It was only the 2 of them, and the small room, and the smell that clung stubbornly to her skin, no matter how many times she had scrubbed it the night before. "You didn't answer my question yesterday," he said. "You didn't ask one I could answer, Your Grace." His mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more private than that, gone before it could fully form. "Fair. Let me try again. What herbs did you use?" Alira considered lying again. She considered several lies, actually, each one worse than the last, each one certain to fall apart the moment Agnes or any other healer in the castle examined her more closely. In the end, she chose the truth, mostly because she could not think of a lie clever enough to survive a man whose senses had already caught what 100 perfumed women in silk could not hide from him. "Valerian root," she said, "spoiled comfrey, and meat, left to rot. On purpose." "Very much on purpose." He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected rather than told him something new. Most women who did not wish to be chosen simply did not attend. Attendance was required by royal decree, Alira said. "I did attend. I merely made certain attending would not matter." Something flickered across his face again, quicker this time, unmistakably close to amusement now, though he seemed determined to keep it locked away where it could not fully surface. "It very nearly worked," he said. "Every woman before you who tried anything similar, and there have been a few, wore something bought from a market stall. Cheap perfumes gone sour. Herbs meant to look unwell rather than truly repel. You built something different, something that should have worked." "Should have," Alira repeated, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "It did work," Cale said. "On everyone but me." The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence Alira had sat through before. Heavier even than the hush that had fallen over the throne room the day before, when he had stopped her mid-step and demanded to know what she had done to herself. She did not understand what he meant, not fully, and something in her chest, some old instinct honed by years of watching Nora diagnose illnesses from the smallest of signs, told her she did not want to understand it either. "Why?" she finally asked. "Does that matter to you?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Alira began to wonder if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, rougher at the edges, as though the words cost him something to say aloud. "Because an alpha's senses are not fooled by what a person wears," he said. "They are fooled, sometimes, by what a person is. And you built something wrong enough, strange enough, that it should have registered as wrongness and nothing more. Instead, it registered as something else." "As what?" He did not answer that question either, not directly. Instead, he crossed the small room, closing the distance between them with a few unhurried steps, and stopped close enough that Alira had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. Up close, she could see faint scars along his jaw and throat, thin white lines mostly hidden beneath days of unshaved stubble, the kind of scars that came from years of battle rather than accident. Up close, she could also see that his pale eyes were not cold at all, not the way they had appeared from across a crowded hall. They were simply guarded, the way a door is guarded, not because there is nothing behind it, but because whatever is behind it has been kept locked for a very long time. "You're afraid of me," he said. It was not an accusation. It sounded, if anything, almost regretful. "I am cautious," Alira corrected. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "Fear makes people foolish," she said. "Caution keeps them alive." Something in his expression shifted at that, subtle but unmistakable, as though she had said something that struck closer to a truth he carried than she could have known. He studied her a moment longer, and then, without warning, he reached out and took her wrist in his hand, turning it gently to examine the skin where the herb paste had been rubbed the day before. His touch was warm, careful, nothing at all like the grip of a man capable of the things the stories said he was capable of. "The smell is fading," he said quietly. "Underneath it there is something else." "There is nothing else," Alira said. though her voice wavered just slightly, betraying her. "There is always something else," Kale murmured, more to himself than to her, and released her wrist as suddenly as he had taken it. He stepped back, putting the proper distance between them once more, the king's composure sliding back over his features like a curtain drawn closed. "You will remain within the castle grounds for observation. Agnes will see to your comfort. You are not a prisoner, Alira Voss, but you are also not yet free to leave." "For how long?" she asked, though she suspected, even as she asked it, that he did not fully know the answer himself. "Until I understand what it is I smelled beneath the rot," he said, and left the room without another word, his footsteps fading down the corridor long before Alira's heartbeat slowed enough for her to trust her own legs to stand. She sat alone in the small examination room for a long while after he had gone, staring down at her wrist where his fingers had rested only moments before, the skin still faintly warm from his touch. She thought of her mother, though she was not sure why the memory surfaced now, of the years spent learning to recognize illness by scent, long before Nora had ever taught her the proper names for what she was smelling. She thought of the jar of rotted meat sitting forgotten in the healer's cottage, of the plan that had seemed so clever 3 nights ago and now felt, in hindsight, like the worst mistake of her young life. She had wanted, more than anything, to be overlooked. Instead, she had been noticed by the one man in the kingdom whose noticing came with no simple way to undo it, and whatever it was he thought he had smelled beneath the rot she had built to hide herself, it had already begun pulling her deeper into his world, rather than pushing her safely out of it. Agnes returned an hour later with a bowl of broth in a small room prepared at the far end of the healer's wing, modest but clean, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the castle gardens. She said little as she settled Alira in, though once, just before leaving, she paused at the door and looked back with an expression Alira could not quite read. 11 years, Agnes said quietly. 11 years. He has not looked at a woman the way he looked at you yesterday. Be careful what you've woken, girl. Some things sleep for a reason. Then she was gone, and Alira was left alone in a strange room in a castle she had never wanted to enter, wondering exactly what it was she had woken, and whether there was any way left to put it back to sleep. Days folded into each other inside the healer's wing, quiet and strange, and Alira found herself settling into a routine she had never asked for, and could not quite bring herself to resent. She rose early, before Agnes arrived to check on her, and spent the mornings helping sort dried herbs into their proper jars, a task that felt familiar enough to steady the constant low hum of unease sitting in her chest. She was not permitted to leave the castle grounds, but within them, she was given more freedom than she expected. She could walk the gardens, she could sit by the window and watch the kitchen staff hang linens to dry in the pale morning light. She could, if she wished, request books from the small castle library, though she rarely did, preferring instead the quiet company of her own thoughts and the herbs she knew how to name in her sleep. What she could not do was stop noticing the guard who had begun appearing wherever she went. He was not subtle about it, not in the way Alira imagined a proper spy might be. He wore his uniform a size too large, tripped over the hem of his own cloak twice in a single afternoon, and once, memorably, walked directly into a low garden wall, while pretending to admire a rose bush that happened to be positioned exactly in Alira's line of sight. His name, she learned from Agnes, was Bram, a young man not much older than Alira herself, freshly assigned to castle duty and clearly still learning the finer points of looking inconspicuous, while doing something as conspicuous as following someone everywhere they went. "You're doing this very badly," Alira told him one afternoon, 3 days into her strange confinement, when he had followed her to the garden bench for the 4th time that week, and made no effort at all to pretend he was there by coincidence. Bram's ears went red instantly, a blush spreading fast up his neck. "I don't know what you mean. You've walked past this bench 4 times in the last hour. There is nothing in this garden worth walking past 4 times, unless you are in fact watching me." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and finally sighed, dropping the pretense entirely with the relief of a man who had never truly wanted to keep it up in the first place. "The king asked that someone keep an eye on your health," he admitted, sitting down on the far end of the bench without waiting to be invited, which struck Alira as either very bold or very tired of standing. "I did not realize I would be so bad at it." "You are terrible at it," Alira agreed, not unkindly, "but I appreciate the honesty." They fell into an easy sort of companionship after that, the kind that grows quickly between 2 people who have both been placed somewhere against their will, and have decided, without quite discussing it, that making the best of it together beats suffering through it alone. Bram was not clever in the way court spies were supposed to be clever, but he was kind, and he was talkative in the particular way of young men who have not yet learned which secrets are worth keeping close. Over the following days, Alira learned more about the castle, and about the king, from Bram's careless chatter than she likely would have learned from 100 formal interviews with Agnes. She learned that Cale Ashgrove had taken the throne at 19, far younger than most kings, after his father died suddenly of a wasting illness that no healer in the kingdom had been able to name or cure. She learned that the war with the Northern Pax, the one that had earned him his reputation and his scars, had lasted the better part of 6 years, and left him with a distrust of easy peace that had never quite faded, even now, a decade after the fighting stopped. She learned too, though this came slower, in smaller pieces, that the king had once had a mate. 11 years ago, Bram said one evening, tossing a small stone idly between his hands as they sat together near the garden's edge, the sky above them bruising slowly toward dusk. Before I was even old enough to hold a sword properly. Her name was never spoken again after she died, not once. Not by anyone who values their position at court. How did she die? Bram's stone-tossing paused, just for a moment, his easy chatter faltering the way it had not faltered on any other subject in the days Alira had known him. Nobody says exactly, he admitted. There are stories. Half of them contradict the other half. Some say sickness, some say the war took her, that she was caught somewhere she shouldn't have been when the fighting was at its worst. What everyone agrees on is that the king has not taken another mate since, and that he does not tolerate her name being spoken in his presence. Alira sat with that information for a long while after Bram had gone, turning it over the way she might turn over an unfamiliar herb, trying to understand its properties before deciding whether it was safe to use. She thought of the way Cale's expression had shifted in the examination room, the careful way he had guarded whatever lived behind his pale eyes, and she felt, for the first time since this strange confinement had begun, something closer to sympathy than fear. It did not last long. Sympathy, she reminded herself firmly, was a dangerous thing to feel for a man who held the power to keep her here indefinitely, a man whose interest in her, whatever its cause, had already cost her the simple, quiet life she had spent years building for herself in Nora's cottage. Still, the thought lingered, uninvited, refusing to be scrubbed away as easily as the smell had eventually faded from her wrists. On the 5th day of her confinement, Alira was summoned again, this time not to the small examination room but to a private study deep within the castle's western wing, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and maps and the particular quiet of a place rarely visited by anyone other than its owner. Cale was already there when she arrived, standing near a tall window that overlooked the training yards below, where soldiers moved through drills in orderly rows despite the years of peace that had settled over the kingdom since the last war ended. "You've made a friend," he said, without turning around, and Alira understood immediately that he meant Bram. "He is not a very good spy," she said. "You should know that before you rely on him for anything important." A short, surprised sound escaped him, something that might have been the beginning of a laugh before he caught it and swallowed it back down. He was not meant to be subtle. "I wanted you comfortable, not frightened. A poor spy accomplishes both without meaning to." "Is that meant to reassure me?" "It's meant to be honest," Cale said, finally turning to face her. He looked tired in a way she had not noticed in their previous meeting. Faint shadows beneath his pale eyes, the set of his shoulders carrying something heavier than simple exhaustion. "I find I have little patience left for anything else." Alira studied him for a long moment, weighing the strange pull of curiosity against the steady, practical caution that had kept her safe for 22 years. "Why am I here, truly?" she asked, not the reason given to the court. The real one. Cale was quiet for long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter, rougher, the same tone he had used when he told her there was always something else beneath the smell. "Because 11 years ago, I lost someone," he said. "And in 11 years, no woman who has stood before me, silk or plain, perfumed or otherwise, has made me feel anything close to what I felt the moment you walked into that hall, smelling like something I should have hated. I do not understand it. I do not particularly enjoy not understanding things, and I am not, by nature, a man who lets a mystery sit unsolved simply because solving it might be dangerous." The confession sat heavy in the quiet study, heavier than Alira had expected honesty from a king to feel. She did not know what to do with it, did not know how to answer a man who had just admitted, plainly and without artifice, that his own senses had betrayed the careful walls he had clearly spent 11 years building around whatever grief still lived behind his pale eyes. "That is not an answer that makes me want to stay longer," she said finally, because it was the only honest thing she had to offer in return. "I know," Cale said, "but it is the truth. and you asked for it." They stood in silence after that, the space between them charged with something neither of them seemed willing to name, until a knock at the study door broke the moment entirely, a messenger arriving with urgent news that pulled Cale's attention away as quickly as it had settled on her. Illyra used the interruption to slip quietly from the room, her heart beating harder than the short, uneventful conversation should have warranted, and did not stop walking until she reached the garden bench where Bram usually found her, though tonight, for the first time since her confinement began, she was almost glad to sit there alone. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake long after the castle had gone quiet, staring at the narrow strip of moonlight crossing her small room's ceiling, turning over the king's words again and again, until they had worn smooth and strange in her mind, like a stone rubbed too many times between careful fingers. He did not understand what he felt, neither did she, and somewhere beneath that shared confusion, quiet and unwelcome, something had begun to take root that Illyra was not at all certain she wanted to let grow. The fever arrived without warning, the way sickness always seemed to, sweeping through the lower wards of the capital in a single restless night, and leaving half a district shivering under thin blankets by morning. Word reached the castle before the sun had fully risen. Agnes burst into Illyra's small room, still tying the strings of her apron, her usually composed face pale with the particular urgency of a healer who understood, better than most, exactly how quickly an illness like this could turn deadly, if left unattended. "The lower wards," she said, breathless. "Dozens already sick. The court physician is overwhelmed. And I am only one woman. I need hands that know what they're doing." Illyra was already reaching for her satchel of herbs before Agnes finished speaking. Whatever strange confinement she had been living under these past days, whatever complicated tangle of fear and curiosity the king had planted in her chest, none of it mattered in the face of sick children and frightened mothers. This, at least, she understood completely. This, at least, she knew how to do without hesitation. The lower wards were worse than she expected. Rows of cots lined the narrow houses, families crowded together in spaces meant for half as many people. The air thick with the particular smell of fever sweat and boiled medicine that Illyra had known since childhood, since the first time Nora had brought her along on a healing visit and taught her not to flinch from the smell of sickness, only from the sickness itself. She moved from cot to cot with Agnes, checking foreheads, mixing tinctures, coaxing broth past cracked lips, and for the better part of 2 days and nights, she barely stopped moving long enough to remember there was a world beyond the shivering fever gripping the lower wards. She did not see Cale during those 2 days. She barely thought of him at all, too consumed by the steady, exhausting rhythm of healing work to spare attention for anything else. It was only on the second night, when the worst of the fever finally seemed to be breaking, that she allowed herself a moment to sit, back against a cold stone wall, eyes closed, too tired even to feel the ache settling into every muscle of her body. That was when she heard footsteps she recognized without needing to open her eyes. "You look like you haven't slept in 2 days, Cale said, crouching down beside her, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the formal weight it usually carried. "I haven't," Illyra admitted, too exhausted to guard her words the way she normally would have. There wasn't time. He was quiet for a moment, studying the rows of cots around them, the sleeping families, the small, steady evidence of a crisis, slowly turning the corner toward recovery. "Agnes tells me you have not stopped moving since you arrived, that you refused to rest even when others insisted." "People were dying," Illyra said simply. "Rest could wait." Something shifted in his expression then, something Illyra was too tired to fully read, though she felt the weight of his attention settle over her differently than it had in the examination room or the private study. He reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face where it had stuck to her damp forehead. She did not pull away. His fingers lingered a moment longer than the small gesture required, and Illyra, too exhausted to maintain her usual careful distance, allowed herself to simply exist in that moment, in the strange, quiet intimacy of a man who had spent 11 years locking himself away from exactly this kind of closeness, sitting beside her on a cold floor surrounded by sleeping strangers. "I smell you now," he said quietly, "without the herbs, without the rot you built to hide it." Illyra's eyes opened fully at that, meeting his pale gaze in the dim candlelight of the sick room, and I understand now why it mattered so little, he said. "The smell was never the thing I noticed. It was what lived beneath it." Before Illyra could ask what that meant, exhaustion finally won its long battle against her body, and she felt her eyes growing heavy, despite every effort to stay alert in his presence. She was distantly aware of him shifting beside her, of an arm settling carefully around her shoulders, steady and warm, holding her upright rather than letting her slump gracelessly against the cold stone wall. She did not have the strength left to question it. She simply let herself rest, for the first time in 2 exhausting days, against something solid. She woke hours later in her own small bed in the healer's wing, though she had no memory of walking there, and understood, with a strange mix of gratitude and unease, that someone must have carried her. The following days brought a slower kind of chaos, the lower wards recovering steadily under Agnes's continued care, while Alira split her time between resting and helping wherever she was needed. It was during one of these visits, tending to a woman well into her 60s whose fever had broken but whose strength had not yet returned, that the first true crack appeared in the careful composure Alira had built around herself since arriving at the castle. The old woman, weak and disoriented from days of fever, reached out and gripped Alira's wrist with surprising strength, her cloudy eyes searching Alira's face with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly very small. "Marisol," the woman whispered, "you came back." Alira froze. Marisol had been her mother's name. "I'm not Marisol," she said gently, though something in her chest had gone tight and painful, an old wound she had thought long since scarred over splitting open with startling speed. "I'm sorry. My name is Alira." The old woman's grip loosened, confusion clouding her expression as the fever's lingering fog pulled her attention elsewhere, but the damage to Alira's composure had already been done. She sat back on her heels, her hands trembling slightly, and for one unguarded moment, memory rushed in with the force of something she had spent years trying to outrun. Her mother had smelled like rotting herbs too, at the end, not from any potion or disguise but from the wasting sickness that had slowly consumed her over the final months of her life, a sickness Nora had never been able to name, let alone cure. Alira remembered sitting beside her mother's bed as a child, remembered the way the smell had grown stronger as the weeks passed, remembered the way visitors had stopped coming, unable to bear sitting with someone whose body had begun to smell like decay, long before death finally arrived to claim her. Alira had learned, in those final months, exactly which herbs could mask that smell, exactly how to mix them so the scent of rot faded beneath something almost bearable. She had used those same herbs, years later, to build the disguise she wore into the throne room. She had not consciously connected the two until this very moment, kneeling beside a fevered stranger who had mistaken her for a mother long dead, but now that the connection had surfaced, she could not push it back beneath the surface where it belonged. She did not explain any of this aloud. There was no one to explain it to, and even if there had been, the wound felt too raw, too newly reopened, to survive being spoken about out loud. She simply finished tending to the old woman, gathered her satchel, and walked back toward the healer's wing in silence, her thoughts tangled somewhere far from the present moment. She did not notice Cale standing in the doorway of the sick room until she was nearly past him. He said nothing. He did not ask what had happened, did not press her for an explanation the way she half expected a king accustomed to answers might. He simply fell into step beside her, matching her pace without comment, his presence steady and undemanding in a way that, despite everything, she found she did not mind. They walked together in silence through the quiet castle corridors, the events of the day settling slowly around them like dust after a long fall, and Alira understood, somewhere beneath the raw ache still sitting in her chest, that the man walking beside her had understood more from her silence than most people manage to understand from hours of careful explanation. Neither of them spoke of it again that night, but something had shifted between them in that unspoken exchange, something neither of them fully acknowledged, though both of them carried the weight of it long after they had parted ways at the entrance to the healer's wing. 3 days after the fever finally cleared from the lower wards, Alira received a summons unlike any of the others that had come before it. This one did not arrive through Bram, who had grown so comfortable in his role as her unofficial companion that he now announced messages with a casual shrug rather than any pretense of formality. It did not arrive through Agnes either, who had taken to treating Alira less like a patient under observation and more like a fellow healer worth consulting on difficult cases. Instead, it arrived through a formal messenger dressed in castle colors, who bowed low and informed her that the king requested her presence in his private study that evening, alone, at an hour well past when most of the castle had settled into sleep. Alira spent the hours before the meeting more nervous than she cared to admit. She told herself it was simple caution, the same practical wariness that had led her to disguise herself in the first place, but some smaller, quieter part of her recognized the nervousness for what it truly was, and refused to examine it too closely. The private study looked different at night, lit by scattered candles rather than the pale daylight of her previous visit, the shadows stretching long and soft across the towering shelves of books. Cale stood near the same window as before, though tonight he was not looking out at the training yards below. Tonight he simply stood, waiting, and when Alira entered, he turned to face her immediately, as though he had heard her footsteps long before she reached the door. "You wanted to see me," Alira said, choosing to speak first, rather than wait for whatever formal opening he might have prepared. "I wanted to ask you something," Kale said, "and I did not want an audience for either the question or the answer." Alira waited, saying nothing, though her heart had begun to beat a touch faster than the quiet room warranted. "Why did you want so badly not to be chosen?" he asked. "Every other woman in that hall dreamed of exactly what you built an entire disguise to avoid. I want to understand why." It was not the question Alira had braced herself for, though in hindsight, she supposed it was the only question that truly mattered. She considered deflecting, the way she had deflected so many of his earlier questions, but something about the late hour, the quiet privacy of the room, and the raw honesty he had already shown her in the healer's wing made deflection feel suddenly exhausting rather than protective. "Because I watched what happened to women the court decided to notice," she said finally. "Women who caught a king's eye did not get to keep their own lives afterward. They became something else entirely. Something built around what the crown needed rather than what they wanted. I have spent years building a life I chose for myself, tending to sick children and setting broken bones, and I did not want to trade that for silk and a crown I never asked for." Kale listened without interrupting, his pale eyes steady on her face, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "There is also the matter of the woman who came before me 11 years ago," he said. "I imagine you have heard some version of that story by now." "I have heard that she is not spoken of," Alira said carefully, "and that whatever happened to her, it left you unwilling to take another mate since." "Her name was not what killed her," Kale said, his voice dropping lower, rougher, the words clearly costing him something to say aloud even now, more than a decade later. "The war did. I made a decision, early in the fighting against the northern packs, that put her somewhere she should never have been, somewhere I believed was safe, and was not. She died because of a mistake I made, not because of any illness or fate beyond my control. I have carried that mistake every day since, and I have made certain, every day since, that I would never place another person in a position to pay for my errors the way she paid for that one." The confession hung heavy in the candlelit room, and Alira felt something in her chest twist at the raw grief, still living so clearly behind his carefully guarded eyes. She understood, suddenly and completely, why he had built such careful walls around himself, why 11 years had passed without a single woman drawing his attention the way she apparently had, quite by accident, with a disguise built entirely to achieve the opposite effect. "You blame yourself," she said quietly. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "I imagine you understand something about carrying blame that does not belong entirely to you either." Alira's breath caught. She had told him nothing of her mother, nothing of the wasting sickness or the herbs she had learned to mix at her mother's bedside, nothing of the strange, painful moment in the sick room when a fevered stranger had called her by a dead woman's name. And yet somehow, standing in this quiet study at an hour when honesty seemed to come easier than it did in daylight, she found herself wanting to tell him anyway. "My mother died when I was young," she said. "A wasting sickness no healer could ever name. Near the end, she smelled the way I made myself smell in that throne room, though hers was not something she chose. I learned, sitting beside her, exactly which herbs could hide that smell, and I used what I learned years later, without fully understanding why those particular herbs were the ones I reached for first." Kale's expression shifted, something gentler than she had seen from him before, though he did not reach for her, did not close the distance between them the way he had in the sick room days earlier. He simply nodded, slowly, as though her words had settled something into place that he had been turning over since the day he first caught her scent in the crowded hall. "Grief recognizes grief," he said quietly, "even when neither person wearing it says so aloud." They stood together in the candlelit study for a long while after that, neither one speaking, both of them carrying the particular weight of loss they had just handed to each other, without demanding anything in return. It was not comfort exactly, what passed between them in that silence. It was something closer to recognition. Two people who had each spent years building careful walls around old wounds, standing close enough now to see, just briefly, what lived on the other side of each other's walls. When Alira finally left the study that night, she carried something new with her, something she could not quite name, though it sat differently in her chest than the fear and caution she had carried into the castle days before. She was no longer entirely certain what she wanted from this strange, unwanted entanglement with a king who blamed himself for a death 11 years past. She was only certain that whatever it was, it had grown far more complicated than simple curiosity or simple caution could explain away. Word of the late-night meeting spread through the castle faster than Alira could have anticipated, the way secrets always seem to travel fastest through places built on formality and appearances. She noticed the shift first in small things. A noblewoman who had smiled politely at her in the corridor a week earlier now looked through her as though she did not exist. A servant who had once offered her extra bread at the evening meal now served her portion last, and smaller than everyone else's. Grace, the baker's daughter who had walked beside her in the choosing line and shared a moment of quiet solidarity that felt like years ago now, found ways to visit her at the healer's wing more often, bringing news from the outside world along with a kind of steady friendship that Alira had come to rely on more than she expected. "They're saying you've bewitched him," Grace told her one afternoon, settling onto the garden bench with the easy familiarity of someone who had visited often enough to feel welcome there. "That the smell wasn't an accident, that you brewed something meant to trap him rather than repel him." "That is the opposite of what actually happened," Alira said, more tired than offended by the accusation. "I know that," Grace said. "But the women still hoping to be chosen do not want to know that. It's easier to believe you cheated than to believe the king simply looked past every single one of them and found something in you instead." Alira understood the logic even as it frustrated her. The remaining candidates for the king's attention, women who had been asked to stay after the initial choosing, women dressed in silk and trained since childhood in the particular arts of courtship and appearance, had spent days watching the king's attention drift repeatedly toward a healer's apprentice who had arrived smelling of rot, and had done nothing since to soften that first impression with any of the polish they had spent years perfecting. Their frustration, Alira supposed, was not entirely unreasonable, even if the way it expressed itself toward her felt deeply unfair. The cruelty escalated slowly, the way cruelty often did, small enough at first that Alira could almost convince herself she was imagining it. A torn strap on her satchel, which she told herself might simply have been old and worn rather than deliberately cut. A whispered rumor, overheard rather than spoken directly to her, suggesting she carried some curse that had addled the king's judgment. A cold shoulder here, a pointed silence there, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but accumulating steadily into something Alira could no longer ignore. It came to a head on a bright, unremarkable afternoon in the castle gardens, when 3 of the remaining candidates cornered her near the rose beds with the particular confidence of women who had never once in their lives worried about consequences for their actions. "You should leave," the tallest of the 3 said. A noblewoman named Fenella, with cold blue eyes, and a voice trained to carry precisely the right note of authority. "Before you embarrass yourself further. The king's interest in you is a passing curiosity, nothing more. He will tire of it, and when he does, you will have nowhere left to go, because you have already made yourself an enemy of every woman standing here." "I did not ask for his interest," Alira said evenly, refusing to let her voice shake despite the tight, uneasy feeling settling into her chest. "I would happily return to my life if given the choice." "Then ask him to release you," Fenella said. "Unless, of course, you have grown rather fond of the attention yourself." The accusation landed closer to a truth Alira had not fully admitted to herself yet, and something in her expression must have betrayed that, because the 3 women exchanged a knowing look before turning away, satisfied they had made their point. Alira stood alone among the rose beds afterward, her hands trembling slightly with an anger she did not fully understand the source of, and it was there that Bram found her some time later, his usual easy chatter absent, replaced instead by a careful concern that told her he had already heard some version of what had happened. "You should tell the king," Bram said. "I will not run to him every time a jealous woman says something unkind," Alira said. "I am capable of handling myself." "This isn't about handling yourself," Bram said, more seriously than she had ever heard him speak. "This is about him needing to know what his court is doing in his name, whether he intends it or not." Alira did not tell Cale. Not that day. Though word of the confrontation apparently reached him through some channel she had not anticipated, because he summoned the full court that evening for an announcement no one had expected. Alira stood at the back of the grand hall, half hidden among the healer's wing staff who had been permitted to observe, and watched as Cale Ashgrove addressed the assembled nobles and remaining candidates with the same absolute stillness he had shown the day of the choosing. "I am aware," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "that certain members of this court have taken it upon themselves to make life difficult for a woman under my protection. I want to be entirely clear about something, so there is no further confusion on the matter." He paused, his pale eyes sweeping slowly across the gathered crowd before settling, for just a moment, on Alira herself. "My interest in Alira Voss is not a passing curiosity. It is not a mistake to be corrected, and it is not a matter open for further discussion among those who believe their own claims to my attention carry more weight than they do. Any further mistreatment of her, whether through word or action, will be treated as a mistreatment of someone under direct royal protection, with all the consequences that carries. A ripple of shocked silence moved through the hall, whispers breaking out almost immediately despite the king's evident displeasure at the very cruelty that had prompted the announcement. Elira felt her face heat, mortification and something far more complicated tangling together, as every eye in the room turned toward her at once, exactly the kind of attention she had spent an entire disguise trying to avoid in the first place. And yet, beneath the mortification, something else stirred too, something warmer and far more dangerous than simple embarrassment. The quiet, undeniable knowledge that a man capable of holding an entire kingdom's respect through iron, will alone had just declared, in front of every noble in his court, that he wanted her, plainly and without qualification. She did not seek him out after the announcement. She returned instead to the healer's wing, her thoughts a tangled mess of gratitude and dread, and it was there, hours later, that anger finally caught up with the fear she had been holding at bay all day. She sat alone in her small room, hands curled into fists in her lap, and let the anger rise, familiar and steadying in a way the fear had never managed to be. Anger she understood. Anger gave her somewhere to stand. She let it burn through her chest until the trembling in her hands finally stopped, and when it did, she felt, for the first time since the confrontation in the rose garden, something close to solid ground beneath her again. Grace found her there later that night, and sat with her in silence for a long while before finally speaking. "He just declared you his, in front of the whole court," Grace said quietly. "How do you feel about that?" Elira considered the question longer than she expected to need. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I know I am no longer entirely certain I want him to let me go." The morning after the king's declaration, Elira woke to a castle transformed, though not in any way she might have hoped for. Fenella and her allies had gone quiet, at least outwardly, cowed by the very public warning Cale had issued the evening before. But quiet was not the same as gone, and Elira understood well enough that women accustomed to getting what they wanted rarely surrendered simply because they had been told to stop. The true danger, she suspected, would come not from open cruelty anymore, but from something quieter, something harder to trace back to any single source. She did not have to wait long to be proven right. It began with small things going missing from the healer's wing. A jar of dried yarrow, gone from its usual shelf. A set of clean bandages, disappeared overnight. Agnes grumbled about careless kitchen staff and disorganized supply deliveries, never once suspecting the true source, but Elira noticed the pattern too clearly to dismiss it as simple bad luck. Someone was testing the boundaries of the king's warning, probing carefully to see how far they could push before consequences actually followed. The matter came to a head 3 days later, when Elira was called to attend a minor noblewoman who had taken suddenly and severely ill, a summons that struck her as strange from the very first moment, given that the woman in question had a personal physician of her own already assigned to her household. Something about the request felt wrong, though Elira could not have said precisely why until she arrived at the noblewoman's private chambers and found the supposed patient sitting up in perfect health, flanked by 2 of her ladies-in-waiting, all 3 of them watching Elira's entrance with expressions far too composed for someone genuinely suffering from illness. "You're not sick at all," Elira said, understanding immediately that she had walked into something arranged rather than urgent. "No," the noblewoman agreed, with the kind of cool satisfaction that told Elira she had already anticipated this exact accusation. "But I did want to speak with you privately, and this seemed the most efficient way to arrange it without drawing attention." "Then speak," Elira said, keeping her voice level despite the unease pooling in her stomach. "You should understand something about the king," the noblewoman said, rising from her bed with the easy grace of someone who had never once needed to pretend illness before today. "He has a pattern, when it comes to women who catch his attention briefly. Interest, intensity, declarations made in front of the whole court, and then, eventually, distance. Duty always wins in the end, healer's apprentice. A kingdom does not run on feeling. It runs on bloodlines and alliances, and you offer him neither." "If that's true," Elira said, refusing to let the words land the way the noblewoman clearly intended them to, "then it will prove itself true without your help. You did not need to stage an illness to tell me something time will confirm or deny on its own." Something flickered across the noblewoman's composed face, frustration at finding her carefully planned confrontation failing to produce the reaction she had hoped for. "You think yourself clever," she said, "but you are a healer's apprentice, pretending at something far above your station, and eventually, even the king himself will remember that." Elira left the chambers without responding further, refusing to give the noblewoman the satisfaction of a reaction beyond the calm dismissal she had already offered, but the words followed her regardless. settling uncomfortably into the same tender place where her own private doubts already lived. She had spent years building a modest, steady life for herself, a life built on healing and quiet purpose rather than crowns and courtly favor, and some part of her, however much she tried to silence it, wondered if the noblewoman's cruel prediction carried more truth in it than Alira wanted to admit. She did not seek Cale out that evening, too unsettled by the encounter to trust her own composure in his presence. But he found her regardless, appearing at the edge of the garden just as the sun began sinking low behind the castle walls, his expression sharp with a concern that told her word of the staged illness had already reached him. "I heard what happened," he said, without preamble. "It was nothing I could not handle," Alira said, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "That is not the same as it being acceptable," Cale said. He studied her for a long moment, something searching in his pale eyes, before continuing more quietly. "She told you I would grow distant eventually. That duty would win over feeling." Alira said nothing, which was answer enough. "She is not entirely wrong about the pattern," Cale admitted, and something in Alira's chest tightened painfully at the admission, even as she forced herself to keep her expression steady. "Kings before me, and likely I as well at times, have let duty override every softer instinct they carried. I will not pretend that pressure does not exist, or that it will not continue to exist for as long as I hold this crown." He paused, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, until he stood close enough that Alira had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "But I did not survive 11 years of guarding myself against exactly this kind of feeling, only to abandon it the moment it finally arrived, simply because guarding against it would be easier." "You make it sound simple," Alira said quietly. "It does not feel simple. Not to me." "It is not simple," Cale agreed. "I do not think anything worth having ever is." He reached out, slowly, the way he had in the sick room weeks earlier, and this time Alira did not hesitate before allowing his hand to find hers. His fingers were warm, steady, and something in the quiet certainty of his grip settled a part of the unease that had been building in her chest since the staged illness that morning. She did not know, still, precisely what she wanted from this strange, complicated entanglement with a king who carried 11 years of grief behind pale, guarded eyes. But standing here, in the fading evening light, his hand wrapped around hers, she understood, with sudden and startling clarity, that whatever she wanted, it was no longer the quiet, uncomplicated life she had built her disguise to protect. Anger had steadied her against the cruelty of the court these past weeks. But standing here now, she reached for something else entirely, something she had spent years keeping carefully out of reach, and found, to her own surprise, that she no longer wanted to push it away. The council chamber had never felt smaller than it did the morning the eldest advisors of the kingdom gathered to discuss, in careful, measured tones, the matter of the king's unconventional attachment. Alira was not present for that meeting, though she learned of it soon enough through Bram, whose loyalty to her had grown steady enough by now that he no longer bothered pretending discretion when it came to sharing what he overheard. The advisors, he told her, had raised every argument the noblewoman in the staged illness had already thrown at Alira directly, only dressed now in the formal language of statecraft rather than personal cruelty. A kingdom needed alliances. A kingdom needed bloodlines carefully chosen for strategic advantage. A healer's apprentice, however capable, brought nothing to the throne beyond herself. He shut it down within minutes, Bram reported, clearly still somewhat in awe of what he had witnessed. Told them plainly that he had spent 11 years letting duty decide everything that mattered to him, and that he did not intend to spend the next 11 doing the same. One of the older advisors tried to push further, and the king told him, quite calmly, that the conversation was finished. Alira absorbed this news with a complicated mixture of relief and unease, grateful for his steady conviction even as she understood, more clearly than perhaps he did himself, exactly how much resistance still stood between them and any future the advisors might eventually be forced to accept. She had grown, over these past weeks, into something she had never expected to become when she first rubbed rotted herbs into her wrists with the singular goal of being overlooked. She had grown into a woman the entire court watched carefully, some with hope, most with suspicion, and a few, like Fenella and her staged illness ally, with open hostility that showed no sign of fully retreating despite the king's public warnings. It was Agnes, of all people, who finally addressed the matter directly, cornering Alira in the healer's wing one quiet afternoon, with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every difficult diagnosis. "You're in love with him," Agnes said, without preamble, setting down the jar of crushed mint she had been sorting and fixing Alira with a steady, assessing look. "I've watched you long enough to see it plainly, even if you haven't said the words to yourself yet." Alira opened her mouth to deny it, the old instinct for caution rising automatically. But the denial died somewhere before it reached her lips. She had spent weeks telling herself this was curiosity, complicated entanglement, unwanted attention she had not asked for and could not easily escape. But sitting here now, faced with Agnes's steady, knowing gaze, she found she no longer had the energy to maintain a lie that had stopped being true, if it had ever truly been true at all. "I don't know when it happened," Elira admitted quietly. "I built an entire disguise to make certain he would never look at me twice. And now I find myself unable to imagine simply returning to the life I built that disguise to protect." 11 years, Agnes said, not unkindly. 11 years he carried that grief alone, refusing to let anyone close enough to ease it. "I have served this castle since before he took the throne, girl. I watched what that loss did to him. I have never, not once in all these years, seen him the way he has been since you walked into that hall smelling like something the dogs wouldn't touch." She paused, studying Elira with an expression that had softened considerably from the wary, professional distance she had maintained during their first meeting. "Whatever you're afraid of, whatever caution kept you safe all these years, I think it's time you asked yourself honestly whether it's still serving you, or whether it's simply become another kind of cage." The words settled deep into Elira's chest, uncomfortable in the particular way that true things often were. She thought of her mother's death, of the years spent building a careful, contained life around herself, as protection against the kind of loss that came from loving something too large and too vulnerable to control. She thought of the fear that had driven her to disguise herself in the first place. Fear not simply of a king's reputation, but of exactly this, of caring for someone whose position and power meant she could never fully protect herself from whatever came next. She thought, too, of Cale's own confession, the grief he carried for a mate lost to his own decisions 11 years past, the careful walls he had built around himself in response to that loss. Walls that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, come down in her presence rather than staying firmly shut. That evening she found him in the same private study where he had first admitted the truth about the woman he lost, standing near the same tall window, though tonight his posture carried a tension Elira had not seen in him since the earliest days of her confinement. "The council pressed you again," she said, understanding immediately from his expression that something difficult had passed between him and his advisors that day. "They did," Cale admitted, "and I told them, again, that the matter is decided as far as I am concerned. But I understand that decision comes with consequences you will bear more directly than I will. The court's cruelty will not simply disappear because I have declared my intentions. It may, in some ways, grow worse before it grows better." "I am aware," Elira said. "Agnes reminded me today of something I had perhaps been avoiding admitting to myself, that the caution I've carried all these years, the very caution that led me to disguise myself rather than risk being chosen, may have become less about staying safe, and more about staying comfortable in a smaller life than the one I actually want." Cale turned to face her fully, something careful and hopeful moving behind his pale eyes, though he said nothing yet, waiting, the way he so often did, for her to finish what she had come to say. "I do not know how to be a queen," Elira said. "I do not know how to survive a court full of women who resent me, or advisors who believe I bring nothing valuable to your throne. I only know how to heal broken bones and boil fevers out of frightened children, and I do not know if that is enough to stand beside a king." "It is not the healing I want beside my throne," Cale said quietly, closing the distance between them, until his hand found her cheek, warm and steady against her skin. "It is you. The healing is simply the shape your kindness happens to take. I do not need a woman skilled in politics or alliances. I have advisors enough for that. I need someone who understands what it costs to carry grief and keep moving anyway, and I have not found that in anyone but you." Elira closed her eyes, leaning slightly into the warmth of his palm, and felt something in her chest finally loosen after years of holding itself carefully closed. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it is time I stop disguising what I actually want." Cale's other hand found hers, drawing it up gently, until his lips brushed against her knuckles. A small, careful gesture that carried more weight than any grand declaration made before the full court days earlier. "Stay," he said simply, "not because a decree demands it, because I am asking." And for the first time since she had rubbed rotted herbs into her wrists with the singular goal of escaping exactly this moment, Elira found she did not want to run from it at all. The formal bonding rite required 7 days of preparation, according to castle tradition. 7 days during which the kingdom's oldest customs demanded the couple be presented separately before their families and advisors, confirming intentions that had already been declared plainly enough for anyone paying attention to understand. Elira spent those 7 days caught between excitement and a lingering unease she could not fully banish, no matter how steady Kale's presence remained beside her whenever the court's disapproval grew loud enough to notice. Fenella and her allies had not disappeared, though their tactics had shifted again, retreating from open confrontation into something colder and more distant. A quiet campaign of exclusion that made clear, without a single word spoken directly, that Alira would never be fully welcomed by every corner of this court, however firmly the king himself stood beside her. She found, to her own surprise, that this particular cruelty bothered her less than the earlier attempts had. She had spent years content with a small, quiet circle of people who mattered to her, Nora and her patients back in the village, and more recently Agnes, Bram, and Grace within these castle walls. She did not need every noblewoman's approval to feel secure in what she had chosen. She needed only the people whose opinions she had come, slowly and carefully, to trust. It was Bram, in the end, who arrived breathless one afternoon with news that shifted the final piece of resistance still standing between Alira and the life she had begun, tentatively, to want. "The council has agreed to formally recognize the bonding," he said, practically vibrating with the excitement of someone who had clearly been waiting to deliver this particular message all day. There was a vote. It was not unanimous, but it passed. The king made clear that a divided vote would not have changed his decision regardless, but Agnes tells me it matters, politically, that enough of them agreed rather than being simply overruled. Alira absorbed the news with quiet relief, understanding, even without Bram's excited explanation, exactly how much easier this made the path ahead of her. A king who ruled entirely against his council's wishes invited instability. A king whose council had, even reluctantly, come to accept his choice, offered something steadier, a foundation less likely to crack the moment difficulties arose. She thought too of her mother in these final days before the bonding rite, of the years spent at her bedside learning herbs and healing, of the woman who had raised her to be practical and cautious above all else. She wondered, sometimes late at night, what her mother might have said about this strange turn her life had taken, whether she would have counseled caution or encouraged her daughter toward whatever happiness she could find, however unconventional its arrival. She did not have an answer to that question. She only had the quiet certainty, growing steadier each day, that whatever her mother might have advised, Alira herself had chosen this path with clear eyes, understanding both its risks and its rewards, and she did not intend to abandon that choice now simply because the road ahead remained difficult. Kale found her the evening before the rite, standing alone in the same garden where Fenella had once cornered her among the rose beds, the same garden where Bram had first admitted, clumsily, that he had been assigned to watch her. So much had changed since that first awkward confrontation, and yet the garden itself remained exactly as it had been, roses blooming steadily, regardless of whatever turmoil unfolded around them. "You're thinking of your mother," Kale said, joining her among the roses, understanding her thoughtful silence with the same careful attentiveness he had shown since the day he first smelled past her disguise in the crowded throne room. "I am," Alira admitted. "I wonder sometimes what she would think of all this. What do you imagine she would say?" Alira considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she had turned over so many difficult truths these past weeks. "I think," she said slowly, "she would tell me that caution kept me safe for a long time, but that safety was never the same thing as living. I think she would want me to choose the thing that scares me, if it also happens to be the thing that makes me feel most like myself." Kale reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity of a gesture they had repeated often enough now that it no longer carried the same charged uncertainty it once had. "Then I hope, tomorrow, you will feel like yourself," he said quietly. Not like a queen playing a role expected of her, simply like Alira Voss, healer's apprentice, who happened to fall in love with a king she tried very hard not to be chosen by. "I did try very hard," Alira said, a small, unexpected laugh escaping her despite the weight of the evening. "An entire jar of rotted meat, wasted." "Not wasted," Kale said, something warm and unguarded moving across his face, an expression she had come to treasure, precisely because it appeared so rarely and so completely, only in her presence. "It was the thing that brought you to me in the first place. I have never been more grateful for a terrible smell in my entire life." They stood together among the roses as the sun set fully behind the castle walls, the quiet ease between them carrying none of the fear and caution that had once defined every interaction, replaced instead by something steadier, something built slowly and honestly across weeks of shared grief, shared stubbornness, and the particular understanding that comes only from two people who have each spent years guarding themselves against exactly the kind of closeness they had finally, carefully, allowed themselves to find. Tomorrow would bring the formal bonding rite, the eyes of the entire court, the lingering resistance of women like Fenella who would likely never fully accept her, and the enormous, unfamiliar weight of a crown Illyra had never sought for herself. But tonight, standing among the roses with Cale's hand steady in hers, none of that felt like the thing that mattered most. What mattered most was simply this: the quiet certainty of having found, in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable, exactly the kind of steady, honest partnership her careful, cautious heart had never quite believed it deserved. The morning of the bonding rite arrived clear and bright, the kind of pale golden sunlight that seemed, to Illyra, entirely too calm for how loudly her heart was beating as Grace helped fasten the final laces of her dress. She had insisted, against the protests of several court attendants who felt the occasion demanded silk and jewels befitting a future queen, on wearing a simpler gown, closer in style to her healer's clothing than to anything a noblewoman might choose for her own bonding day. Cale had supported the choice without hesitation when she raised it with him days earlier, telling her plainly that he wanted her to come as the thing that had first caught his attention, not as some polished imitation of every woman who had stood in that hall beside her and failed to hold his gaze the way she had, entirely by accident, all those weeks ago. "You look steady," Grace said, studying her in the small mirror once the final lace had been tied. "Not nervous, steady." "I feel steady," Illyra said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that it was true. The nervousness she had carried through the 7 days of preparation had settled somewhere overnight, into something calmer, something closer to certainty than fear. The ceremony itself took place not in the grand throne room where the choosing had first thrown her into this unlikely path, but in a smaller chapel adjoining the castle's western wing, attended only by those closest to both Illyra and Cale, a deliberate choice made to keep the day feeling personal rather than purely political. Agnes stood near the front, her usually stern expression softened with something close to pride. Bram stood beside her, having clearly borrowed a formal tunic several sizes too large in his continued inability to master the art of properly fitted clothing. Grace sat near the back, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief despite her earlier insistence that she would not cry. Cale waited at the front of the chapel, dressed simply, without crown or ceremonial armor, exactly as he had promised. When Illyra walked toward him, the small gathered crowd rising respectfully as she passed, his pale eyes held hers steadily, carrying none of the guarded distance she had first encountered in the crowded throne room weeks earlier. Whatever walls had stood between them then had long since come down, brick by careful brick, through fever wards and garden confrontations, and quiet confessions, shared in a private study lit only by candlelight. The ceremony itself was simple, built from old words neither of them needed to memorize, because the officiant spoke them slowly enough for both to repeat with steady voices. When the moment came for the bonding mark, an old tradition symbolizing the joining of two lives rather than any literal physical bond, Cale took her wrist gently in his hands, the same wrist where rotted herbs had once clung so stubbornly that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove the smell. "I remember exactly what this wrist smelled like the first time I held it," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear. A small, private joke shared between two people who had built an entire relationship from the unlikeliest of beginnings. "I am glad, every single day since, that I did not let it fool me." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the small gathered crowd, breaking the solemn tension of the ceremony just enough to remind everyone present that whatever grand political weight this bonding carried for the kingdom, it remained, at its heart, a joining between two people who had genuinely found something worth keeping in each other. "I built that smell to make certain you would never look at me twice," Illyra said, her own voice steady, despite the emotion tightening quietly in her chest. "I have never been more grateful to fail at something in my entire life." Cale's expression softened further at that, something unguarded and complete moving across his face, and when he leaned down to seal the bonding with the traditional kiss, the small chapel erupted into warm, genuine applause, entirely unlike the cold, calculating silence that had greeted Illyra's first appearance before this same man weeks earlier, in a very different room. Afterward, as the small gathering moved toward a modest celebration held in the castle gardens rather than the grand formal banquet tradition usually demanded, Illyra found a quiet moment alone with Cale near the same rosebeds where so much of their difficult, careful courtship had unfolded. "The council still worries about the future," Cale said, watching the gathered guests mingle at a comfortable distance. "Fenella and her allies have not disappeared, and they will not disappear simply because today is finished. There will be difficult days ahead, political challenges neither of us can fully anticipate yet." "I know," Illyra said, "but I have spent my whole life learning to face difficult things steadily, one at a time, without needing every answer before I begin. I imagine ruling beside you will require much the same skill, simply on a larger scale than boiling fevers out of frightened children. I have great faith in that skill, Kale said, drawing her hand up to press a slow, careful kiss against her knuckles, the same gesture he had offered the night before the ceremony, though it carried, somehow, even more weight now that the bonding had been formally sealed. Alira thought, standing there among the roses with her new husband's hand steady in hers, of her mother, gone now for so many years, and of the wasting sickness that had taught her, however painfully, the exact combination of herbs that had eventually led her, by the strangest possible path, to this exact moment. She thought of the anger she had reached for so often these past weeks, familiar and steadying, and understood now that it had simply been protecting a softer thing underneath, a thing she had finally allowed herself to trust enough to let show. The grief for her mother had not disappeared. The weight Kale carried for the mate he had lost 11 years earlier had not vanished either, not fully, not in a single ceremony however meaningful. Some wounds, Alira understood now, simply did not close entirely, no matter how much healing followed. They became, instead, part of the steady foundation two people built together, carried side by side rather than alone, which somehow made all the difference in the world. The sun continued its slow arc across the garden sky, as the small celebration carried on around them, laughter and quiet conversation drifting through the roses, and Alira Voss, healer's apprentice, turned queen entirely by accident, stood beside the Alpha King she had once tried desperately to repel, and found, at last, that she had never once truly wanted to be anywhere else.